Hello and welcome to History Stuff. After a break of several weeks in the lockdown, as you can see, I've got hairier and hairier until I now resemble something like the wild man of the woods mixed with some crazy academic professor from late night BBC 2 in the 1970s. But maybe that fits the whole sort of feel of this channel. So before I shave everything off, I think I'll go with it a little bit. So I just wanted to pick up on the subject that I was talking about most recently, which was the life and career of Gruffydd ap Llywelyn, Lord of Southern Powys in the 13th century. And I want to just round off my account of his career in one, maybe two more videos before moving on to something else. So I think I'd got him up to the year 1277, which is the year of Edward I's first war against Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, Prince of Wales. This ends in a very emphatic defeat for Llywelyn for many reasons, but one of the main problems he experienced was that he could not hold on to the loyalty of the majority of Welsh princes and landowners outside of his heartlands in Gwynedd. So before the war really starts, he's already lost the majority of his support base. Most of these Welsh landholders, they join Edward, they fight for the king. And among them is very much Gruffydd, who deserted Llywelyn's allegiance several years before in 1274 and is now very much a crown loyalist again, as he was in the days of Edward's father, Henry III. So why has Gruffydd done this? Well, for the same reasons that he's done anything in his career. He's acting out of self-interests, and he's putting the needs of his dynasty and his lordship of Powys first before everything. And at this point in time, it serves those interests to fight for the King of England rather than the Prince of Wales, because Gruffydd and Llywelyn are now deadly enemies again. So what happens at the end of this war is quite interesting, because Gruffydd plays an important role in the fighting in the Middle March on the borders of Wales. And he is given custody of the castle of Dolforwyn, which was built by Llywelyn not only to guard mid-Wales against English invasions, but also to impress his power, the power of Gwynedd, upon this part of the section of the Middle March, and to really overshadow Gruffydd's power just a few miles away at Welshpool. Llywelyn was stamping his authority on this sector of Wales, and why Gruffydd, one of the reasons Gruffydd turns against him is because he's not comfortable with having the Lord of Gwynedd, his ancestral enemy, so close to his doorstep. And at the end of the war, he is actually given custody of the castle that Llywelyn had started building back in 1273. Dolforwyn is quite an impressive castle, just about 4 miles from Gruffydd's base at Welshpool. And he thus gains control not only of the castles of Welshpool and Dolforwyn, but also the markets, these very prosperous markets that both the castles are adjoined to. So Gruffydd has really once again come up trumps here. He's made the right decision, and he's come out of this whole very messy and awkward situation on top. He's smelling of roses again. And in the following years, he manages to maintain his position despite legal challenges from the likes of Llywelyn, who's trying to claw back the power and the authority he lost as a result of losing the war, and from aggressive neighbours, principally Roger Mortimer, Llywelyn's cousin, a very powerful and aggressive baron on the marches. And he does this quite skillfully, or very skillfully, very successfully, certainly in the case of Llywelyn. What Llywelyn tries to do is challenge Gruffydd for control of a piece of land called Arwystli, which is a piece of upland territory northeast, northwest of Powys. And in itself, the land isn't very valuable, but it's what it represents, the political symbolism of who controls this piece of territory. Because after 1277, Llywelyn does not have any technical authority over anywhere in Wales outside of Gwynedd, west of the River Conwy, because Edward has dismantled the principality, and while he leaves Llywelyn with his title of Prince of Wales, it's purely nominal. He is stripped of all of his political and military gains of the past 20 years, and he no longer has any tangible authority outside of this part of Gwynedd. But what he does is mounts a legal challenge to claim his ancestral rights in Arwystli and another adjoining territory called Cyfeiliog. And he's quite confident that he's got a genuine legal claim to these lands. But Gruffudd has got his own claim to them. He registers a counterclaim, and so you go from a situation where everyone is at war and there's a military conflict going on to a legal conflict. And it's really just an extension of the same struggle. These very powerful and ambitious men are using just different tools. They're using the courtroom instead of the battlefields to play out their rivalries and their territorial ambitions. And Gruffydd's method of seeing off Llywelyn's challenge is quite clever, very devious. What he does is he secretly conspires with a man called Adam of Montgomery, who, despite his English-sounding name, is actually a descendant of an ancient lineage of Welsh kings. And Adam and his brothers are persuaded by Gruffydd to mount their own claims to the land of Arwystli. And then one by one, as the case proceeds, they withdraw those claims. And the effect of this, because they withdraw their claims in favour of Gruffydd, is to enforce his claim to the land. Because on the face of it, it looks like a whole string of rival claimants have shown up, but they have withdrawn their rights to the land because they formally declared that Gruffydd has a greater right to it. Now, of course, Adam and his brothers don't have any real hope or any real sort of desire to claim Arwystli, to get the land. They've been almost certainly bribed by Gruffydd to do this. Just to bolster his own legal position and make his claim look more impressive than Llywelyn's. And this would work. Gruffydd would have won the case via this very devious method, except that the ultimate arbiter of the case, the judge, is King Edward. He is now in effective charge of most of Wales, and he will be the arbiter. He decides the outcome of these legal cases. And Edward's attitude is quite interesting. He doesn't want Gruffydd or Llywelyn to have the land. Not necessarily because he wants it for himself, because that's not really how kingship works. He doesn't need to have direct control over individual sections of territory in Wales just to prove his lordship, because he is the feudal overlord of the principality anyway. He doesn't need direct control. That's not what he's trying to achieve. What he's trying to do is avoid putting a weapon in the hands of either man. Because if he finds in favour of Gruffydd and he lets him have Arwystli, then that will give Llywelyn all the political support and all the propaganda advantage that he would need to say to the other lords in Wales, look, King Edward has treated me unjustly. He's found in favour of Gruffydd rather, which is totally unfair. So you can see what kind of king he is. He's a complete tyrant, and you should all come back to me, swear allegiance to me as Prince of Wales again, and we'll try and throw the king out and restore a native independent principality, albeit independent under my control. But on the other hand, if Edward finds in favour of Llywelyn and he gives him the land, then Gruffydd will be offended. And Gruffydd is Edward's most powerful supporter among the native princes, and he has always held the balance of power, certainly in mid-Wales, for the past 30 or 40 years, going back to the middle of the reign of Henry III. Edward is perfectly aware of Gruffydd's history and his patterns of behaviour. Gruffydd does what is good for Gruffydd, and if he thinks that you're not doing him enough favours, he will quite happily go somewhere else. And of course what he'd probably do is try and renew his allegiance with Llywelyn. So Edward's in a a bit of a catch-22 situation. You might think that because he's the king and he's won this war against Llywelyn, that this puts him in this sort of unassailable position of supremacy. But it doesn't really. What it does is present him with a fresh set of problems. And he's not all-powerful in the sense, in the sort of popular sense of, or just how powerful were these medieval kings, especially someone like Edward I, who's seen as this very sort of overbearing, centralising character who insists on drawing all power into his hands. It's not that easy. And so his response is to simply sit on the case as it rumbles along over the years, about the next 5 or 6 years after 1277. And despite the repeated petitions from the rival parties, Llywelyn and Gruffudd and their representatives, Edward will not make a decision. He won't come to judgment on either side. And he's doing what in modern parliamentary terms is called filibustering, whereby you stand up in Parliament and you waffle on about nothing very much, purely in the hope of prolonging a session long enough for the other side to just sort of give up and get bored, or for the time limit on a certain piece of legislation to run out. So you've effectively defeated it that way. You haven't presented a counter argument, you've just beaten the time limit. And this is what Edward is doing. He doesn't want to give himself a problem by finding in favour of either of the Welsh princes. So he just sort of, he stonewalls the whole thing. Every time Llywelyn sends him a petition and says, "Your Majesty, when are you going to make your mind up about this?" Edward says, "Oh, well, some point. I'll probably discuss it in the next Parliament, or the one after that, or when hell freezes over." And what he's hoping is that Llywelyn and Gruffudd will simply get bored, Llywelyn especially, and that they'll drop the case. It should be pointed out that nobody is being particularly honest, as you might expect in this court case. I mean, while Gruffudd is certainly guilty of putting up false claimants, and Edward is guilty of just sort of doing nothing in the hope that this whole awkward situation will go away, Llywelyn isn't being particularly honest either. He bases his claim to the neighbouring land of Cyfeiliog on the basis that the Prince of Cyfeiliog, a chap called Owain Cyfeiliog, in the late 12th, early 13th century, had quitclaimed or granted this land to Llywelyn's ancestor, Llywelyn the Great, in 1217. And that is what Llywelyn's claim to the land is based upon. Unfortunately, Owain Cyfeiliog died in 1197, 20 years before this supposed transaction took place. Now, either Llywelyn's lawyers made a mistake and they didn't realise this, which, you know, is, considering how precise and knowledgeable that Welsh lawyers were about the genealogy of princes and their own laws and customs, that's pretty unlikely. Or Llywelyn is just trying to pull a fast one and hope that nobody notices. And so it goes on, this sort of legal merry-go-round. And this is one of the things, this unresolved case is one of the factors that leads to the Second War, much more bloody, dramatic and desperate conflict really of 1282, which I will get onto in the next video, because well, you could record a whole string of videos about what happens in 1282 and 1283, because it is extremely dramatic and packed full of controversy and incidents and all kinds of murky things going on. But for the time being, it's enough to say that nobody really moves from their initial position. Llywelyn, quite reasonably, is hell-bent upon clawing back at least some of the power and authority that he lost in 1277. Edward is intent upon really maintaining the status quo. He's, at this stage anyway, he's got no intention of destroying the Prince of Wales, because that would be too difficult and too costly. You'd have to invade Snowdonia for one thing, and that's never been That's never been a good idea. Past English invasions over the past 200 years have generally come to grief trying to do that, to go into the mountains, especially in winter, is not easy. And Edward doesn't really want to do that. He's quite content to exercise his overlordship in a very sort of overbearing way. He's not an easy man to have for a boss at all. He's a sort of micromanager who's forever leaning over your shoulder and prodding you and asking what you're doing. But he doesn't want to destroy Llywelyn if it can be avoided, because it's just too difficult and too expensive. And then you have Gruffydd, who is pretty much doing what he's always done, because it's worked very well for him. If you remember right back to the start of these videos, he started with nothing really. His family were driven into exile. He was raised in England. He was born into very shameful and humiliating circumstances for a prince of a noble and ancient lineage in Wales, and by one means or another he's clawed his way back to the top. He's in quite a secure position in 1277 through to 1282, although he has to keep fighting off all these other claimants and challenges, but he's done very well. But his success at this point rests entirely upon his relationship with the English, with the King of England. So when the war breaks out again in 1282, in very different circumstances to the previous war, Gruffydd is not going to budge really. His survival and the future of his dynasty does rest with remaining a crown loyalist, or an English loyalist if you like. And again, as I've addressed in previous videos, he's been called a traitor and a turncoat by various patriotic historians over the past 200 years. But personally, I think that is to misunderstand the era and the nature of the man and of the times and the society that he lived in. It's far too simplistic. But okay, that's enough for now, I think. I might go and have a shave, or at least clip some of this hedge. And hopefully speak to you again later.